Welcome to It Came from the Grove, our paranormal, weird history, and world folklore podcast. Tonight we have author Jim Breyfogle with us, whose newest work is a Victorian fairy tale romance about necromancers, dragons, mermaids, vampires, zombies, and adventure on the high seas. Hello, Jim.
Good afternoon.
Anything else you'd like to add to your introduction?
That was a great introduction. Thank you. And it sums up a lot of the major sort of characters and it is an adventure story. So the point of the book.
Amazing. Looking forward to getting straight to it. I am Wistmoor, VTuber Druid, fairy researcher, strange news hunter, illustrator of wonders, and first time shirt owner. That's a story for another day.
And I'm Wisteria, potion maker, meme brewer, herbalist, and mythology enthusiast. And on a quick note, we are responsible for the cover of A Bad Case of Dead.
Look at that beautiful cover.
Yeah, it's pretty. It works well with the story, and the story is even better.
All right, Jim.
If I can just jump in, I've gotten quite a few very complimentary comments about the cover. So it's
Awesome.
being quite well received among friends and family.
Great, great. Love to hear it.
I wanted to also share that now that the cover is out, that the campaign is still going.
Yes.
We have some of the progress of painting that we want to share on Twitter.
Okay.
So today, tomorrow, it will slowly go out so people can see the sketching process, the painting process, that things come along slowly, but they sure make pretty things.
Very cool. All right, Jim, can you tell us about all of the supernatural elements in A Bad Case of Dead?
Wow. Yeah, that's kind of a tall order, and I'll probably forget some. Just a brief bit of background for the listeners. A Bad Case of Dead is everything that you said in the introduction. It's set in London in 1846, at least that's where it begins. And the main character, a young Cornish man named Edward Truscott, has a spot of bad luck, and he contracts dead. Without going too deeply into it, that basically means that he is dead. Um, but it's a progressive sort of disease. So when he wakes up and realizes that he's no longer alive, he feels a little icky, but he's still pretty much himself. But consulting with people who know a little bit more than he does, he finds out that this is sort of a degenerative disease, and he will progressively become what you think of as a zombie, a violent, mindless, um, no longer thinking, no longer human creature that just runs amok. So he has a very limited amount of time to try and figure out what he's going to do and if he can cure the case of dead that he has, which people tell him is not possible. But if it were possible, then he would have to get the help of a necromancer. And there aren't any of those in London because necromancers have made such bad neighbors in the past that all of them have been driven out of the wide world. So he has to embark on a quest to see if he can locate a necromancer. And then if he can do that, then try and convince the necromancer to help him. So it's a travel story. It's him leaving London and sailing from the wide world to what is known in the book as the narrow world. Um, and the narrow world is where all these supernatural um, people and beings have sort of found refuge from the wide world, which is not very accommodating for them. So as Edward travels and reaches the narrow world and goes from, because it's an archipelago, he goes from island to island as he's trying to get closer to the necromancer. And he comes across a wide variety of supernatural creatures. And some of them are merely mentioned. I mean, in passing, you find out that, there were pixies, but there aren't anymore because pixies just they were annoying, and humans make bad neighbors at times as well. So the pixies were done away with, and there are no longer giants, but they're mentioned. But we do see things like the merfolk, and of course, um, Ed is a zombie, so we're right there with him along the way. We meet vampires. the cover that you just mentioned, the gentleman who is standing in the middle of the ocean holding the prow of the boat in a very threatening, intimidating fashion is a guy named Restless Davy. He's tolerably supernatural, I think. Um, there are carnivorous deer, which are kind of like they look like the Chinese water deer, the little tiny ones, except they're giant and they eat flesh. You have, of course, the necromancer to reach the narrow world, because the narrow world is partly in our world, but partly out of our world because it's a realm where magic still exists. To kind of make that brief jump between the two, you need the help of a sea witch. So the ships that travel between London and the narrow world all employ a sea witch to help them navigate. There are sorceresses. There's the last outpost of Atlantis. There's
Oh wow.
a place called yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's a place that Edward needs to retrieve something from, which is called the House of Sorrow, and that's not in our world at all. If the narrow world is half in our world, the House of Sorrow is not in our world at all. Um, and then kind of in the background, you have a secret society which is trying to hunt and destroy all of those things. So I I don't because I write fantastic stories, fantasy
Yeah.
sorts of adventures. I don't normally think of it as supernatural per se. I usually think of it as fantasy. But when you ask me about the supernatural elements and I stop to think about it, I'm like, wow, this really does have um, you know, a lot of things that sort of come out of folklore or come out of that supernatural, magical tradition.
Yeah, perfect. Because that's what we explore on this channel and this podcast. And I did notice a lot of those supernatural elements because you've got this whole kitchen sink of weird, and that's one reason why we were excited to work on this with you. But another thing that's sort of central to what we do is bringing wonder to our world because we talk about the supernatural through folklore actually being real experiences that people had of crazy stories in the past. But what are your thoughts on bringing wonder to our world through fiction and writing?
Yeah, it's interesting because when people say, what do you think of as like a sense of wonder? I kind of like sort of default to Bill Watterson of Calvin and Hobbes. And yeah, I mean, who doesn't like Calvin and Hobbes? But sort of that childlike sense of awe and amazement, which isn't always what, wonder in terms of horror and supernatural, because it can be, really dark and scary as well as being awe-inspiring. But in a way, dark and scary is still awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
And bringing wonder into the world, I mean, through writing or something like that, I think it helps to kind of have that Calvin and Hobbes view of the world is a wonderful place. And you can see it around you. And it might be something really, really grand, like standing at the top of Sleeping Bear Dunes looking over Lake Michigan or the Rocky Mountains or the Mediterranean coastline or something, which is just, you don't always think of it as wondrous, um, but you can kind of cultivate that mindset that this is really, I mean, if you're standing on looking at, the Greater Yellowstone Falls, it's amazing. I mean, it's just a great thing to be able to see. And if if you see it in the small, and if you're a parent, I mean, you can find a sense of wonder in your kid's laughter or something like that. Um, or the small feeling of accomplishment when you do something that you didn't think that you could do. Um, so I think from a writer's viewpoint, if you start from a point that there is already wonder here,
Yeah.
then you can bring the wonder that you see around you into your stories. And you can either, like shine a light on it, have characters who recognize that this very natural thing is still wondrous, or you can kind of turn it and introduce some fictional element, some fantasy, some fantastical, sort of make it bigger or make it smaller, do something different with it that amplifies that element of wonder in a unnatural way, a supernatural way, if you will. But you're still trying to create as the reader. So let me just back up a little bit. And for me, the sense of wonder is when you can look at something or experience something and say, that's really cool.
Yeah, it's a
And
simple way to put it.
yeah, and that's what you want from your readers. You want your readers to be able to read a scene and see something, whether it's a creature that doesn't exist anywhere but your work and say, that's really cool. Or a character that has some power and say, that's a cool power. I wish I could do that. Or something like that that just makes them stop and enjoy.
And be able to
Maybe not to the
experience,
level of like, right. Maybe not to the level of, oh my gosh, I'm awestruck, but
yeah,
a little bit of that. If I can do that as an author, then I've accomplished something.
yeah, and be able to, for them to experience something they might not have experienced yet, or may want to experience, but it's something that's outside of their own personal experiences that they get to vicariously share with the author.
Right. And maybe it's something that they could if the opportunity arrived, or maybe it's something that nobody can experience because it's, science fiction or
Yeah.
fantasy.
And that brings us to what is your relationship with folklore, the weird, paranormal, fairy tales, all that?
That that's a good question. I'm kind of betwixt and between personally. I'm sort of a show me and I'll believe it kind of guy.
Okay.
But I'm also the sort of person who's like, a lack of evidence does not mean that it doesn't exist. Just because I've never seen X, Y, or Z supernatural thing doesn't mean that it's not true. And I'll sort of throw out the example of, like ESP. Just because you can't prove that somebody has the power of prophecy doesn't mean that people don't have hunches or things that have a really weird way of bearing out.
Right.
If somebody says I have the power of prophecy, I'll probably look at them and say, yeah, I kind of doubt it. But does that mean that in general, that sort of trait might not be buried somewhere deep in the human toolbox? I don't know. I'm willing to be convinced.
So when
Um,
you say that you're the kind of guy that needs to be shown to believe, have you or anyone close to you had any paranormal experiences?
yeah, it, again, sort of betwixt and between. So the closest I've had to a paranormal experience, and I do know people who believe in this stuff, lock, stock, and barrel, in whatever way they do, whether it's sort of the traditional religious way where they believe in demons and angels, or whether it's more of a folklore sort of way
Yeah.
where that sort of thing. My personal experience I view as completely inconclusive. I think it's funny. I wouldn't completely discount it, but it does not enough to push me into the absolutely this is a ghost story that proves the existence of ghosts to me. But it was probably about 20 years ago. We had bought an old house because, of course, it's always an old Victorian house, isn't it? Built in 1876 and had gone through many owners in the past and had done a little bit of remodeling and reconfiguration. And when we bought it, it had been broken up into apartments, and we returned it to a single family home. And um, one of the people who had grown up in the house probably 35, 40 years before happened to stop back in town and wanted to see the home where she grew up. And so she knocked on the door. And of course, we brought her in and showed her around, and she saw everything that had changed, and she could tell us how it had changed. And then she started telling stories about the house for when she was a little girl. And apparently, she was absolutely convinced that this house was haunted. And some of the stories that she told were pretty innocuous. She had a younger brother, and there were times when the brother was too young to be left alone, and the parents were talking about, well, we need to go do something. What do we do with our child here? And her younger brother would pipe up and say things like, oh, don't worry about me. The man in the house will take care of me. And it happened enough times that they were convinced that this young child was seeing a man in the house that nobody else could see. Fairly innocuous.
Yeah.
Also, the woman who was talking to us, her mother grew up in a house where her mother, the grandmother, wore petticoats, and she swore that in the evening time she heard a woman walking around the house wearing petticoats because she could never forget that sound, and she was absolutely certain that that's what was going on. And of course, there's nobody walking around the house in petticoats. And then in the middle of the night, a regular occurrence was they would hear footsteps coming up the front staircase, walking down the hallway to where the parents were sleeping in the back bedroom, and stopping outside their door. Very clearly, not a question of do you hear anything? It's a question of who's in our house. And of course, there was nobody in the house. And it happened so often that the father began sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed.
Wow.
I have to say, when you
So these
started
are the
your
stories
story,
that she's
so
telling us about our house.
Yeah, and she has nothing to gain from telling you these stories.
Right. Absolutely nothing. And she did say that toward the end of their ownership of the house, they took the front staircase out and they reconfigured it and put a new one in. And once they did that, the footsteps up the staircase stopped completely. They never heard them again. And I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. And all this stuff, I mean, this is fairly standard haunted house stuff. And it's interesting to talk about. We haven't lived there all that long, but in this brief period of time that we've been there, we have nothing, absolutely nothing to indicate that the house is haunted.
That's
So we
good.
don't think anything of it. She goes her way. About a week later, in the back of the house, and this house is very, very linear. It's one room after another after another. So if you want to go from front to back, you basically have to go through all the rooms of the house. So on the second floor of the house, in the very back, is a closet door that's sticking at the bottom, and it's one of those big, solid wood, multi-panel doors that probably weigh 60 or 70 pounds. And to make this thing stop sticking, I need to take it down and I need to cut like a quarter, half an inch off the bottom. So I take it off its hinges. I carry it from the back of the house to the front of the house, down the stairs, from the front of the house to the back of the house, down the stairs, from the back of the house to the front of the house to where my workshop is. And I set it up on the sawhorse as I run the jig. I cut the bottom of the door off. And then I do the whole process in reverse, lugging this stupid heavy door from the front to the back and up the stairs, from the back to the front and up the stairs and front to the back, and put it back on the hinges. And all I've done is taken a half an inch off the bottom, and it won't fit on the hinges anymore. And
Oh,
I
wow.
don't understand this. And of course, I'm already kind of hot and tired because it's a warm day, and I've been lugging that stupid door. And this is not a short house. Up and down, on all around. So I kind of jiggle it a little bit and it won't go on the hinges, and I jiggle it some more and it won't go on the hinges. So I take it back down and off and I put it back up and it won't go on the hinges. And I wrestled with this stupid door for probably 20 minutes. And I just couldn't get it to go on the hinges. And there's no reason, because I haven't done anything to the door frame. I haven't done anything to the hinges. All I've done is taken a half an inch off the bottom of the door. And I'm sitting there, and I'd like to say I wasn't swearing, but the truth is, after 20 minutes of this, I was swearing. And suddenly I remembered this woman coming in a week before and telling us ghost stories about the house. And it popped into my head. I'm like, if this house is truly haunted, they're laughing at me.
Yeah, or
They're looking at all this effort and they think, what an idiot.
you've been
So
wrestling with a ghost.
yeah.
So at that point, for no good reason except impulse, I'm holding this door. It's not on the hinges. And I just look up and look around the room. And I said out loud, well, you could help me. And I lifted it up and it went back on the hinges without any effort at all, perfectly set. And I dropped the pins back in place and it was done.
Amazing. That's a good story.
That's a ghost of a
So I don't know if that
handyman.
qualifies as a real ghost story or not, but that's kind of the closest I've come to supernatural
Yeah, that's a
ghosts
great one.
happening to me.
Well, I have to say, I think I heard too many ghost stories because when you started to talk about it, I thought you were about to say that that woman that visited you, you found out a week later that she died a long time ago, which was not real.
No, not that I know of. She was a very nice woman. I can picture her, but I can't remember her name. And she had moved away and she was back in town for some reason and she wanted to revisit the house where she'd grown up. And it was great for us because I'm kind of an old house junkie. I mean, it's one of the reasons why Bad Case of Dead is a historical fiction because I like that sort of thing.
Yeah, in the Victorian
Um,
era.
yeah, yeah, and hearing, I mean, if you have an old house, old houses have a lot of history, and a lot of it you don't know because two families back, whatever they did with the house has all been redone or covered up or repainted or something like that. So hearing some of her stories, what was for us a new house was pretty cool.
So, in A Bad Case of Dead, Edward, the main character, is a zombie.
Yep.
What are your feelings or what's your take on modern zombie stories?
So in some ways, you know, I said that I lean heavily into the fantasy elements. So I in some ways this was a little bit out of what I normally do because I don't set out to write a horror story,
Yeah.
and I don't really consider A Bad Case of Dead to be a horror story per se. Um, and my sort of knee-jerk reaction to modern zombie stories is kind of like everybody's trying to escape the zombie apocalypse, and you have um, hordes of mindless zombies overrunning everything, and Uncle Bob is pounding on the door trying to eat your brains. And um, I don't know. I mean, zombies lends itself to the modern horror story really well because right away you're starting off with a lot of dead bodies. Um, but I just sort of feel like modern zombie stories lean heavily kind of into the shock value and the gratuitous violence of, you know, you have the creepy music and then the zombie springs out suddenly with a gotcha sort of thing. And then somebody goes to work with an axe and and a chain gun. Um, that's not what I'm doing here. And I know that there's probably a lot of zombie stories that also aren't doing that sort of thing. But because this is a little bit unique for me, um, I don't read as broadly into the supernatural horror as I might.
Yeah, so how was your approach or what's your idea of zombies in A Bad Case of Dead? How is that different from what we normally think of like zombie apocalypse kind of media?
Yeah, so like I said, I didn't really start out to write a zombie story. It's not like, oh, zombies are hot right now. I need to write a zombie story. And in some ways, I'm way behind the curve because zombies were hot before. Um, and they've probably cooled off a little bit now. Um, but when I have a story, I kind of like feel compelled to write that story. And you can't get away from the zombie because the main character is one. So to put a little bit of separation between myself and maybe a modern zombie story, I started off. One of the first things I did was to go back and sort of research the roots of zombies and that sort of thing. And of course, you know, they're big in the Caribbean and New Orleans and that sort of stuff. But a lot of it came from West Africa. So I kind of traced the entomology back to West Africa instead of calling them zombies. And I'm calling them zombies here because that's, you know, it's what they are. It's what everybody expects to hear. But in the books, they call them Zumbu or zombies, because there are numerous roots in West Africa for the zombie idea, and you can kind of choose between a couple of them. And that's one to place them more in the historical time period, but also to remind me as an author and the reader that this is not a 1990s slasher zombie story. This is an 1846 historical fantasy fiction the zombie here is not the same zombie as it is in The Walking Dead. Um, and it's, I mean, sometimes people will say to write a new story, just take an old idea and turn it sideways. That's what I did here. I mean, I won't say that it was, I'm going to write a story and this is what I'm going to do to create the story. It was more like I have this idea and this is what it turned out to be. Um, because most zombie stories are, how do you deal with the zombie?
Yeah.
You know, they're rising out of the ground or they're doing something, and the living humans have to deal with this plague of zombies. Uh, In this case, it's different because Ed is the zombie. He's the point of view character, and he has a problem. But his problem is not that he is a violent, mindless killing machine. His problem is that he will become a mindless killing machine. So in that way, it's very different from a kind of traditional zombie story. And he does. I don't want to give away too many spoilers around, but he does manage to slow down the progression, so he has more time than your average zombie to find a solution. But it's obviously not unlimited. That ticking clock is still going on in the background. And he comes across some other zombies who are exactly what you would expect. Their case of dead has progressed to the point where they're not even there. The violent beast.
So now that you told us your take on zombies and the mother take on zombies, I also believe you came up with an unusual take on vampire powers. Can you share your vampire concept?
Oh yeah. So, you know, every author and every story has characters that they like. Kind of favorite ones. You're supposed to like all your characters equally, like your children, but unlike your children, there are some that you like more than others.
You
And I
have
will say,
favorite
coming
children.
back to um, coming back to the cover, Restless Davy is one that I like a lot. He's a fun character. But another one that I like a lot is Uncle Baldwin, and Uncle Baldwin is a vampire, and he's kind of a quirky middle-aged guy with an interest in contemporary science. But vampires, as Uncle Baldwin will tell you, are the greatest of the not deads. Although he's a little unclear about what this entails. He's very proud of the fact that if you have to be an undead, then being a vampire is far better than being a zombie. One of the things he does disclose is that in 150 years, 200, 300 years, he'll be exactly what he is now. Whereas poor Ed will be probably destroyed for his own good. Um, but as I'm looking at Uncle Baldwin as a character, the question I ask is is Uncle Baldwin primarily a vampire, or is Uncle Baldwin a person with vampirism? Which sounds like it's splitting hairs, but it felt like they were important hairs to split in this case. If he's a vampire, then you get a character who's centered on drinking blood and their immortality and all the vampire traits because you're focusing on the vampire aspect of who they are. But if he's a character who has vampirism, then you suddenly get this quirky old guy who loves to garden, but he has to do it at night because he can't go out in the daylight. And Uncle Baldwin, by the way, is very proud of his garden full of flowers that only bloom at night. Um, he tries to keep up with scientific research at the same time that he's trying to manage disease that is very destructive to the people around him. Um, so yeah, I'm in some ways what I try and do with something like this is if you go off in completely different direction, you might end up with vampires that aren't recognizable as vampires. So why do you even call them a vampire? What I try and do is take something that is familiar because Uncle Baldwin is a vampire. He needs to drink blood to sustain himself. Um, but once you set that aside, he's Uncle Baldwin. He's who he was before he contracted vampire, just like Ed is who he was before he contracted dead. Um, and that I think lets me do a little bit more with him as a character. I mean, he's not usually a vampire is an obstacle you need to overcome. In this book, he's not necessarily an obstacle, but he is a character that they need to interact with to achieve their ultimate goals.
And I don't know if you knew this when you were writing this, but the Victorian Age was a period where vampire plays and operas were the rage, because it was just after Lord Byron started this fragment called The Vampire. And that like marks the change from the folklore view of vampires to a more charismatic, aristocratic kind of character of a vampire. Um, but but yeah, so the Victorian age is like when we see this birth of this kind of vampire that we're most used to.
Yeah, and Uncle Baldwin, he's not aristocratic.
Okay.
You do see, kind of the commanding um, presence of vampires who can enscroll you to do what they want you to do, kind of put the spell over you and take away your free will. Um, Uncle Baldwin comes across as kind of a peevish old guy at times. Uh, he's basically a decent person, but he can't engage in normal society because as a decent person, when he gets hungry, bad things happen. So he needs to try and manage that in a way that leaves him kind of alone, kind of wishing that people would visit him more often. Um, but visiting him, you better make sure he's eaten before you stop in, sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think what is interesting is because this is the change from folklore to fiction, that where it changes how we view vampires. But it was in the 1700s, like just before the Victorian age, that vampires were a very real thing, and you could find these antique vampire hunting kits, and they weren't, just for display. And European traditions abounded for different ways to deal with vampires. So there is this sort of interplay between folklore and fiction definitely has a weight. It has a weight that is stronger than folklore these days. But it is interesting to go back and see where all of these ideas started. So we've talked a little bit about necromancy and the influences you got from Western Africa. How much of that, like voodoo and hoodoo, is in A Bad Case of Dead?
Less than you'd think.
Okay.
This is primarily kind of a travel adventure quest story, and it starts, with Edward contracting dead, um, reaching Nikaya is the guy's name who might be able to help him. Is the goal for much of the book. So the people who know a little bit but not enough to cure Edward are saying we don't even know if he can do it, but if anybody can, he's your man. So most of the book, he's 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 in the distance, and they need to overcome all the obstacles, both supernatural and otherwise, just to reach him. And then when Edward gets there, he finds out that there's a reason necromancers make bad neighbors. Is the guy's just a jerk, and he doesn't want to help him. And it's not that he can't help him, or at least he won't admit that he can't help him. It's just that he just doesn't want to. He's not interested in it. So Edward needs to kind of convince him and strike a deal with, okay, what do I need to do to make you help me? Which then sets him off on the little side quest. So he has to leave Nikaya's home to go and try and fulfill the terms of the contract that it just came with. And then when and if, because I don't want to give too many spoilers away, he does that, then he would have to return. So the amount of time in the book that Nakaya is actually on the page is surprisingly little for the role that he needs to play in Edward's cure. Which is good because I really don't know any of the rituals that go with that.
Okay. Yeah, and there are some other like fun concepts happening here with like the narrow world is something you've come up for this book. What kind of connection, if any, does it have to the legends of Fairyland and Avalon from Arthurian Tales?
Yeah, consciously none. I wasn't thinking of that when I created it, so um, have to think, how much. I mean, obviously, I've read the Arthurian legends and other stories of changelings and fairyland and things like that. Um, I kind of have to say not much. I mean, there is something about traveling through space and arriving in a world that is not entirely our own. So there's obviously that parallel going on there. Um, and if you wanted to equate all the refugees to supernatural people and creatures who inhabit the narrow world as sort of the equivalent of the fairies, then you could draw that connection as well. But they're not sort of like this uniform, this is the realm of the fairies. It's more like this is a hodgepodge collection of creatures that are no longer welcome in the wide world.
Okay.
Um, and to reach the narrow world, I mean, I've read different accounts of reaching fairyland, and sometimes you just sort of stumble in, and sometimes you need a little bit of help.
Yeah.
Um, the narrow world is the same in that regards. I mean, technically speaking, there's a couple lines in there where if the circumstances are right, you might find your ship wrecked in the narrow world, and props to you because that doesn't just happen to anybody. But generally speaking, you need the help of a sea witch who can kind of work the currents of magic to guide you in the right direction. Although
Ah.
they do make a reference that if you have a terrible sea witch, you might end up in a place where you don't expect to be, and somebody ended up near Bath with a prow pointed towards Stonehenge because their sea witch was so bad.
So that's where the sea witch on the island on that cover there comes in.
Actually, that's a little different. Though there's the sea witch who stays on the boat, um, getting them from London to the narrow world. Um, Edward actually ends up leaving the ship before they reach there. And then in the archipelago, there is kind of this. I've called her the siren in the past because what she did was steal the voices from the siren in the ancient world. So she's a sorceress who has the ability to steal lives from people, and she uses the siren's voice to lure people in so that she can steal their lives and perpetuate her own life. And that's the one who um, is closer to the time where the cover illustration is.
Okay.
In fact, they're just leaving Parlexi's cavern when they run into Restless David.
And we've talked a little bit about the intersection of folklore and fiction. But one reason why I think this conversation is important is I wanted to get your author insight on what fiction can convey that fairy tales and legends and folklore can't.
Um, yeah, fairy tales and legends. I mean, because a lot of them are kind of teaching tales, um, or cautionary tales, which is also teaching. Um, they're created to offer insight almost by definition. Do this, don't do that. If you do this, bad things will happen, kind of thing. But they are static. What you think of as fairy tale and folk tales are written down. And so if something new happens or something, there's a development, then um, going to the Brothers Grimm is not going to offer any insight. Whereas a modern author, they can write anything they want to, and they can offer insight or develop stories with analogies or otherwise on things that would have been unfamiliar with people who were kind of discovering, if you will, or creating and then passing on the fairy tales and the myths and the folk tales. And one example of this, I guess, might be something like, like a drug addiction or something like that. You'd be pretty hard pressed to find too many examples of drug addiction in fairy tales and mythology. But a contemporary author can change it a little bit, make it more period appropriate or the right tone or something like that, and then you can include those sorts of things in your story. Whereas the fairy tales might have kind of like a blind spot to some of the more contemporary problems.
Yeah, and it can't really talk as much about motivation, perspective, and feelings like fiction can.
Yeah, yeah, and that's, I mean, a lot of the characters, I think, in fairy tales, I mean, we like them and we can relate to them insofar as we can relate to the situations that they're going through. Um, a lot of them, and I don't mean to say that this is all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of them don't really grow and change as characters. The stories they may be too short for that to happen. Um, and something like Anansi, the Anansi stories are great. I love them. Um, they are entertaining. They're all that, but Anansi doesn't change. I mean, he is who he is throughout all of them, and I think we ask more from that in contemporary fiction.
Yeah, and so you're sort of borrowing from this collective folklore and like concepts and from fairy tales. How do you think your readership or your reader base has, or what kind of link are you utilizing here when you write about all of these supernatural elements?
Uh, Do you mean like how do I expect the readers to sort of be on board with what I'm saying?
Yeah, like so I understand there's kind of like a shorthand if somebody understands like the rudimentaries of the concept, rather than making up your own fantasy world, I guess.
Right, right, okay. Yeah, so a lot of it depends on who your audience is, on what you can expect from them. So like if you're writing something for a YA audience, then you're assuming that they probably don't have the same sort of background and breadth of knowledge that an adult audience would. So you may have to take some more time to explain things to them. I tend not to do that. One, because it's beaten into you. As soon as you say, I want to write a story, the first thing anybody, well-meaning person will say to you is, show, don't tell. So I don't like to write a story where I have to do a lot of explaining. I'd rather have a little bit of explanation and more showing, and then we're good to go. And I sort of assume that if people are reading my books, they're probably coming out of the same sort of literary tradition that I'm writing from, which means that they're probably reading um, fantasy adventure books. Um, they've probably read more than just mine, and then they've probably consumed other media that dabbles in that sort of thing, whether it's TV shows or movies or had conversations, because who hasn't had a conversation around a campfire of the spooky, you know, slasher guy in the woods or the urban legends or something like that. And all those things kind of go into what you know and understand of a subject. And I kind of make the assumption that if I were to throw out the term unicorn, somebody reading my book has read enough stuff in the genre that I don't have to explain that a unicorn is essentially a horse with a long single horn coming out of the forehead. I can bank on the fact that they know what the unicorn is, and they know what the Pegasus is, and they know all the other things that are familiar from mythology because maybe they've read the Sisters Grimm, or maybe they've picked up um, uh, I'm trying to think of the guy's name who did the Encyclopedia of Mythology, and that's slipping my mind at the moment. But if they haven't read all of those things, they've at least touched base or seen um, things like that. And then when I create something like the fumarole fish, which is in the story, which is completely made up. You're not going to see it anywhere else. And it's basically a giant jellyfish that will ensnare its prey in its tentacles, and then it will cook them.
Okay. Yeah, so
Um,
it's like a cooler version of a kraken.
yeah, yeah. But I recognize that something like that, my readers will not have any idea if Edward's guide just says, "Oh my gosh, it's a fumarole fish. We got to get out of here." People will be like, "I don't get it. I don't know what a fumarole fish is. Why do they have to get out of here?" And that, of course, that's perfectly understand that nobody knows what that is because I made it up. And if it's something like that, then I need to take the time, and I mean, it's great because Edward doesn't know what it is either, which means I can have my other characters explain to Edward why he needs to get out of there, and at the same time, I'm explaining to the reader so that they also understand why Edward needs to get out of there.
Yeah, and this kind of leads me to the question of like, what were your inspirations for the fairy tale aspects of A Bad Case of Dead?
That's a good question because I'm writing stories, and so I guess it's just Tolkien, when he was writing about writing, says that everybody has what they call leaf mold, and the leaf mold is everything that you've read, that you've heard, that you've watched, that has happened to you, that just sort of percolates in the back of your mind. And out of that composting of experiences is what your stories grow from. And that's probably what happened. It's if I thought about a specific thing, like I need to know, you know, the origins of zombieism. I knew I wanted to know the origins of zombieism, so I went and I would research that. Um, but all the experiences of, I growing up reading, we had a series of books in elementary school of, myths of the world. I loved those books, so I was always checking out the myths of Egypt, myths of Greece, myths of South America, myths of Norway, and I'd read those, and I'd read the stories of King Arthur and his knights, and I'd read Robin Hood, and I'd read the folk tales of America, so like Pecos Bill and Calamity Jane and Paul Bunyan and Johnny Appleseed and John Henry, um, and read Hans Christian Andersen, wonderful stories, and the Brothers Grimm, and Grimm is a good word for a lot of those stories, but they're also good stories, and all that sort of stuff just sort of kicks around in the back of my mind, and as I'm drawing Edward through the narrow world and thinking of, what would create that sense of, oh, hey, that's cool, um, something would pop out. And sometimes it would be like, oh, yeah, that's cool. Um, or something would more like, I can work with that. Let's see if we can make this my own and make it similar but different and cool kind of thing.
Yeah, and I want to play off of that because how much of a good story is like a muse, magic, inspiration, or just luck?
Yeah, I could say they're all the same thing.
Okay.
Um, but they're not really. I mean, in some respects, when I say an idea pops out, why would an idea pop out at that time as opposed to any other time? When you have a thought that's completely unconnected to the thought that went before it, how can some people just say, the spirit moved me or inspiration struck or I just got lucky. Um, it might as well be magic or something like that.
Yeah.
That feels a little bit simple to me because, I mean, you can be in the right spot for inspiration to hit, and then the luck that you were there is different from the inspiration that you had. So if I just say they're all the same thing, I'm kind of, making it um,
It's
more simple than it probably is.
it's kind of cool because it goes full circle back to asking for help with the door and also sort of the supernatural elements of writing.
Right, right. And then there's also, I mean, Edison on invention says that, hard work and craftsmanship is a huge portion of whatever you're doing. Um, and, the hard work also leads to the inspiration. I was writing a story one time. It's part of the Mongoose and Meerkat series, and I had a creature that needed to be killed, and of course, you want your creatures to be difficult because you want a lot of that tension and question of, oh my gosh, are they going to be able to do it? And I made the thing too hard to kill. Just couldn't figure out how the main characters were going to do it. It took me like 3 weeks of figuring out. I mean, you can't puncture its hide, you can't crush it, you can't asphyxiate it, you can't poison it, you can't do this, you can't do that. And just the hard work of trying to figure it out eventually leads to the inspiration of saying, I can't do all these things, but I can do that. So now let's figure out how to make that happen. And again, I mean, that brings us back to the very beginning of the question, though, is where did that inspiration come from? Did it come out of luck? Did it come out of the hard work? Did it come out of, magic by definition is unexplainable. If it was explainable, it wouldn't be magic. But if I can't describe why I had the thought, then yeah, it might as well be magic.
So, if inspiration can strike at any time, um, you need to weave those moments of inspiration. And do you think, is there a formula to writing suspenseful fiction?
Uh, that's a good question. Um, I don't think of myself as a formula writer. When I think of a formula writer, I think of like the Harlequin romances or something like that. But if you just make it a little less rigid than the Harlequin people do, and you just think of a formula as what goes into writing, a good tense story. To get that tension, I think a lot of it has to do with pacing. It can't go too fast and it can't go too slow. If it goes too fast, then it's over too quickly and people don't get to savor the feeling. If it goes too slow, then it becomes boring and they don't stick around to see how things end. Um, and I think another major portion of writing something that is mysterious and full of tension um, is mystery. Mystery is uncertainty, and I think the uncertainty is really important in that because the reader has to want to keep reading, so they need to be invested in the characters, but there also has to be a credible doubt to the outcome so that they want to see what happens. And if they already know what happens, or if they believe they know what happens, you're not going to have that good sense of tension. And you can cover up a lack of tension. And it works with certain audiences. I mean, if you're watching, say, a Disney movie, there are parts in Disney movies toward the end that can be pretty exciting and they can scare little kids, but an adult will appreciate the action and scene like that, but they're never going to buy in that Disney is going to give you an unhappy ending. That tension that maybe things won't work out is just not there. To really, really set the hook, you need to try and create in the audience a belief that they don't know what's going to happen. Um, and it's hard because we like stories where the good guy or girl um, wins in the end, and we kind of expect it. So if you say, oh, there's a 50-50 chance, well, the protagonist wins in 100% of 50-50 chances. So right away, you have a hard sell on the uncertainty. So you end up with things like in the Avengers um, with Doctor Strange talking about how the tens and hundreds of thousands of futures he's looked at, and in only one do we win. So it's not even 50-50 to get buy-in. Um, but if you can somehow get that uncertainty into the reader's into the mind, and this is why somebody like George R. R. Martin was so successful in what he did, is because he killed a few characters in the first um, Game of Thrones book that, man, I would never have expected anybody to kill. And from that point on, suddenly I'm like, wow, I need to pay attention to this because I don't know who's going to live and who's going to die. And so with good pacing and uncertainty, you have people who are really invested in the story, and it's tense because you need to pay attention, and the bad things could happen, so it's credible.
Yeah, and I do think there's a tension between subverting expectations and writing a good story based off of formula. And I guess that kind of brings us to like the whole idea of the hero's journey. And I think you have an interesting story about hero's journey and pyramids.
Yeah, so I'm sure most of the listeners are at least somewhat familiar with Joseph Campbell's Hero's Quest. Um, the idea that the the protagonist somehow has um, the steps of the of the journey in front of him, and that all great epic adventures, whether it's Beowulf or the Odyssey or something like that, follows this quest, and they're all essentially the same. Um, and some people have gone, and honest, I'm not, a Joseph Campbell scholar or anything like that, so I don't know how hard he pushed it versus how hard it was pushed by people who have embraced his work. But there are some people who kind of say, if you're writing this, then it needs to follow the hero's journey. And if you don't follow all the steps, and there's a ton of steps, but if you don't follow them all, then somehow this is not legitimate, or things like that. And there are some people who suggest that folks are trying to force things into the blueprint of the hero's quest because they have to.
Yeah.
And and thinking about it, I was thinking about, because I have two daughters, and one of them is getting a doctorate in nautical archaeology, which is super cool to me, and I love talking shop with her. But even though it's nautical archaeology, she has to take a fair bit of terrestrial archaeology um, on the side, and she was talking about ancient building forms and structures with one of her professors, and the pyramids came up. And of course, there are people who believe that the pyramids are kind of like bestowed upon humanity by aliens. Because how can you have the pyramid structure showing up completely independently in so many different regions of the world? I mean, they have them in the Far East, they have them in Egypt, they have them in South America and Central America, and there's no evidence that shows that these cultures had any connection unless it was done by aliens. And so the fact that everybody all over the world is building pyramids is proof that the aliens came down and helped these ancient peoples learn building techniques because they taught them all to build pyramids. And my daughter's archaeology professor, according to her, had a kind of bemused smile on his face and said, or it's just the easiest way to pile rocks. Which it's a humorous turn of phrase there. And I was thinking about that the last time that we were, kind of talking about the hero's journey. Um, and I'm like, I'm not saying that Campbell is wrong, because it's pretty clear that these stories do share similar characteristics.
Right, like
But
mythology sort of has that hero's journey. They probably weren't working off of a formula.
right, and does it mean it needs to be a blueprint? Can you build something that's not a pyramid? Can you write a story that's not the hero's journey? Are we making too much of this? Because you could take probably anybody's life, no matter how normal, and cast it in the realm of the hero's journey. You have somebody who they grow up and they want to, like become an independent, full human being. So they have a call to adventure. You need to like go out and become an adult. But they don't want to because a lot of kids have a good childhood and they want to enjoy it while they can. And then you have supernatural intervention. The state says, here's your diploma. You have graduated from high school. It's time to leave the house. I mean, you can cast a lot of human experiences in that mold if you want to. So it feels like the hero's journey is a very relatable way to tell stories. Because even if we're not involved in heroic endeavor, we still recognize some of those same struggles and things in our own lives. So it's not surprising to me that people all over the world, as they're telling these fantastic stories, are also tying them back into the lives that people are living around them. And so when people start talking about, oh, if you want to write an action adventure story, you need to go to Joseph Campbell and you need to research the hero's quest and you need to follow that pattern. I'm kind of like, maybe we're just piling rocks here. I mean, it's a great thing, and pyramids are great, and the hero's quest is also great because there's some really, really cool stories that are told that follow this pattern. But maybe just like you can build buildings that aren't pyramids, we can tell stories that aren't the hero's quest. Or maybe because pyramids do come in different shapes, whether they're step pyramids or ziggurats or whatever. I'm not an expert on all the different forms of pyramids, but maybe we can tell hero's quest sorts of stories that have significant variations in them. And we don't have to get too worked up about the hero's quest. I mean, if you want to get into that sort of thing, I recommend go ahead, research it, have fun, learn something because it will help you build your craft. But maybe don't get so tied up in it that it becomes more constricting for what you're trying to do than enabling.
Yeah, and this has been amazing because you've interwoven all of these concepts perfectly. Um,
Oh,
and I wonder if you could give us a final pitch for a bad case of dead to our fans of the strange. And I've got the link in chat and also the description for people that are watching this later. And we've got the campaign up here and Kickstarter with 20 days to go.
And I want to also congratulate you because you have 65 backers already.
yeah, yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you. We
that's
got a good
amazing.
start. A little more than halfway there already, so
Mm-hmm.
that's very encouraging. Obviously, we'd like to reach a few more people, and I very much appreciate your willingness to have me on, and hopefully we can tempt a few people to seeing what a bad case of dead is about. It's a fun book. I very much enjoyed writing it in part because and I tend to write kind of my stories tend to be episodic. And this is very episodic. I mean, like the Odyssey is episodic because Odysseus goes from one spot to another and has adventures in each one. Edward's kind of doing the same sort of thing, and I enjoy doing that because it allows me to bring in a wide variety of characters and settings and situations, and that's fun. When I sit down to write, I enjoy it, and I hope that readers will enjoy it, having that sort of and find that sort of this is cool or wow moment um, in several places. Hopefully, I mean, hopefully the entire book, but maybe some more than others.
Yeah.
You'll see a lot of the familiar supernatural stuff, but hopefully with a little bit of a different take at it, so that you won't have to sit down and scratch your head and say, is this a vampire? Is this not a vampire? But you'll be able to say, this is a quirky vampire and I really like him, sort of thing.
And I think that's
I
what
will,
fans of Strange enjoy, is just those, oh, cool moments.
yeah, well, hopefully, that's my goal. I don't want to insist that they will find them in my book, but I rather hope they would. And I will take the opportunity, because this is a Kickstarter, so there is a little bit of time between the fulfillment of this, when it ends, and you'll actually get a copy of Bad Case of Dead. Alex, who's running it through Kirsova, is always faster. I mean, when he says we hope to have fulfillment by June, I've never seen him not come in significantly before that time. But because you guys are pitching towards kind of the fairy tale and mythological audience, if somebody did want to read something I've written before Bad Case of Dead came out, I wrote a book called The Paths of Poor Manor, which leans heavily into Norse mythology, and that is available now. In fact, it's one of the add-ons for the Kickstarter in a digital copy, which those are fulfilled almost immediately after the thing ends, or you could, pick it up on Amazon.com or something like that. So, yeah, I thank everybody who's been listening to this, and encourage you, if it sounds intriguing, to, yeah, absolutely look into it and see if it's something that you'd like to pick up.
Yeah, and actually, I do own the first volume of Mongoose and Meerkat and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah, great. I wasn't going to mention that, because that's more traditional sword and sorcery.
Yeah.
For those who don't know, the Tales of the Mongoose and Meerkat was published by Kirsova magazine. It was serialized, but it's not one of those, can Batman avoid being turned into a surfboard? Come back next week. Each story is a complete story. So if all you have is the first volume, then when you're done there, you don't feel like you need to buy more to get to the end of the story. I will say that there are 3 volumes of it, and when you get to the end, you realize that there was stuff going on in the background that sort of weaves the stories together, and there is a clear and definite ending to the story arc. All 3 of those books are available. The last story was published in the winter of 2023 issue of Kirsova, but the books, you can buy the books without buying the magazine.
Great. Yeah, and Jim Breyfogle's works do come recommended from It Came From the Grove. I've enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you.
But thank you again for joining. This was an amazing conversation.
Yes, I really enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
All right, and good luck on the Kickstarter. And
we're gonna end this stream like we usually do with Catch You Out in the Wild.